Okay. So so today we are talking about behaviour change, and we have 3 projects that were part of the learning resource, and 2 of them have joined us today. I'm just trying to move you so you're not in the way of my slides. So yes, sorry, it's 3 projects from Frome Kidlington and which is near Oxford and Cumbria. And this is quite a staggering fact that 3/4 of greenhouse gas emissions are actually produced by households. So that was from a report by the Imperial College London. So actually, measuring, changing individuals' behaviour, and then can have quite an impact if we can do that to big groups of people. And we will cover a little bit about maybe how you measure that behaviour change as well within this presentation. So these are some of the overall lessons that came from the 3 case studies that we did. So finding motivation that suits your particular audience. And I think in all 3 cases, they were very clear that that's not always related to climate change. And the projects that they run don't always have a climate change focus, kind of outward facing. Obviously they do inward facing, but they're not always really shouting about that. And making the facts and figures relatable to everyday life. So the benefits to people might not necessarily be those climate benefits. And sometimes when you look at things like carbon saving information, it can be quite gobbledygook to some people. So really making that, like, what does that actually mean for me, or changing it into a figure that means something as a big collective. I think it's quite difficult on an individual basis to sometimes understand what some of those like carbon saving things mean. A common theme with the projects was saying a really big thank you as a reward. So kind of collecting up all that individual effort and saying a thank you to a big, in a community way. That's a reward in itself, and something that communities really appreciate. And then in terms of being able to measure, obviously we've talked about this for the entirety of the CAF's projects, but collecting baseline data so that you can make comparisons further down in your project, and collecting qualitative data. So particularly, I think, around behaviour change, the power of stories is really important, and a really good way of feeding back the changes that have been made. So it's not always about figures, and actually those stories really mean things to people. And then this is a lovely one, and I'll hope that Hayley might pick this up a little bit when we talk about the Cherwell Collective's project. But finding the elements of climate and nature that people are really passionate about, and using that to motivate them. So kind of doing some research into what's important to the communities that you're working with. It might not be the obvious, and I think in this case it wasn't. And that's really interesting that you can kind of make these assumptions as to what would bother people, but actually it might be something different. And so it's really important to ask those questions. Some of these don'ts are kind of almost the opposite of the do's. So not overwhelming people with the complicated facts, kind of harks back to making your facts and figures relatable to the communities that you're working with. This was a really interesting one, and again was something that Emily from Cherwell Collective said, but that assuming that you have to change an attitude in order to change a behaviour. I think we're quite used to that kind of journey where you change the attitude and that leads to behaviour change, but actually not always necessary. And yeah, don't assume that your plan will lead to the behaviour change that you expect. It might lead to something else, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But that's why it's really important to get that baseline and that qualitative data so that you can see the changes that are actually being made. And don't give up the first time. There may be different interventions and motivations that you could try. So it's all really good learning, and that's really important. So these are some lovely pictures from the 3 case studies that we talked to in order to build this resource. So a green and healthy future for Frome. Unfortunately, they couldn't be with us today, so I'll whiz through their case study. But then Zero Carbon Cumbria, and the lead partner for which is Cumbria Action for Sustainability. And we have got John with us today, so he's going to share their story, and the Waste Innovation Station headquarters, or WISH, which is run by Cherwell Collective, and we have got Hayley with us as well. So that's lovely because they can really talk about their projects and in their own words. So we'll start off with a green and healthy future for Frome. So this is a partnership project between Adventure Frome, which is a community enterprise school, Frome Medical Practice, and Frome Town Council. And they run a range of initiatives around the co-benefits for so the kind of idea behind it is that creating healthy people will in itself reduce climate, create climate benefits or reduce climate problems. So a healthier person is a more climate conscious person. It can also help save them money while reducing their climate footprint. So so when we talked earlier about making the benefits and the facts and figures relatable, because this comes from a medical practice, it's already a really trusted person within that community in terms of what the health benefits are. But in making those referrals or those actions with those people, it is in turn actually having a positive climate effect. So things like encouraging people to use bikes. Obviously, we can see how that would have healthy and climate benefits. And they've done some really interesting, there's lots and lots of projects, which if you go onto the resource online, it goes into more detail, and obviously you can search them and have a look at their website, because there is a huge host of projects that they're doing. So their motivation, so this is the individual's motivations for changing their behaviour. So they're very keen that they recognise and understand that there's a huge range of factors that motivate individuals. It's not always about them getting healthier, it might be about them saving money. Some of them are motivated because they want to have a positive climate impact, but that's very individualised. And so the project is recognising that. They're also very aware of, and I'm sure you all are, especially in the current climate, of acknowledging the socioeconomic context and the difference between more vulnerable communities. And so that, the most deprived communities actually have a lower carbon footprint because they don't run cars and or as many cars, but they are more vulnerable to the climate and health risks, and so would have bigger benefits from making the changes. And so that's quite a sensitive balance. And I think all three projects spoke about the balancing act of that. So more socioeconomically privileged people do find it easier to engage, but actually the personal benefits are not as valuable to them. And this was really key. This was within the medical practice itself, but their staff need motivating as well. They're not necessarily all climate activists, they work in a medical practice, and so they need constant kind of almost convincing, I suppose, that there are benefits on both sides. And what their project found was that once they started to recognise those benefits, so see the health benefits in the people that they were working with, it became more standard practice. They could kind of see the reasons behind why they were making those particular referrals. But yeah, just a note that it's not always about participants, it's sometimes about the whole team. So measuring their behaviour change, Frome, Green and Healthy Future for Frome did do a huge town-wide survey at the beginning of their project to baseline perceptions, attitudes and behaviours, and it was repeated 2 years later. I think they thought about repeating it a year later and decided that actually that wasn't a long enough period to measure changeover, and so changed it to 2 years. And I suppose within all of that there was COVID and all sorts of things as well, so very big different in context. And yeah, as we mentioned earlier, they've really valued the qualitative as well as the quantitative data. So actually they had a change in evaluator partway through the project, and at the beginning they really had been concentrating on quantitative data, And it wasn't until this new evaluator came in that they started to see the value of that qualitative data and their ability to then be able to tell the stories and how powerful that is. So really, a really interesting learning for that particular project. They, within that survey, are using the ONS 4 questions. So they're questions from the Office of National Statistics about measuring wellbeing. And what's really interesting about using them is that you can then make comparisons of your participants or your town or your area with the national average. And so you can see maybe then how you're changing compared to that. And it's quite a helpful contextual comparison to be able to make. Yeah, and this is really key, but being rigorous and ensuring that your questions remain the same so that you can then compare them, particularly if you're going to run a survey, over a number of years. We know that behaviour change doesn't happen overnight. So if you're thinking you've got a 10-year project, you need to make sure that the questions in year 1 are the same, or if not very similar to the questions in year 10, or you can't actually properly compare them. And I think that's about monitoring and diversity questions as much as it is about the qualitative questions. So I'm going to hand over to John to talk about zero carbon Cumbria. And John, just give me a nod when you'd like me to move the slide on. Now I'll mute myself so that you're...
Will do. Thanks, Emily. So just a brief introduction to some of our work and the links with the behaviour change. So our project is really a portfolio of activities from community-led delivery through to some strategic work with some of the key stakeholders in Cumbria. And behaviour change actually is a theme throughout that work, not just influencing day-to-day behaviours of individuals, householders and businesses, but also the strategic behaviours of what we refer to as the gatekeepers of emissions, so that throughout our story of change is what we're trying to do is to engage people, build up their knowledge, motivation, agency for a whole range of different behaviours. But one of the key elements of it is very much the community-led delivery and the value and importance of behaviour change being led by and influenced by members within the community. And this slide shows a picture of some of our community climate champions who are actively promoting behaviour change in their local communities. So next slide, Emily. So just to pick up on a couple of the points that covered in some of these key lessons around making sure that we look at the issues from the perspectives of the audiences that we're engaging with. And it's interesting to me, I think from an environmental perspective, obviously our priority is the emission reductions, if like that's the main benefit that we're looking for. And we often refer to co-benefits of health or cost savings. From some of the audiences that we're engaging with, but I would suggest their priority or interest will be in the cost savings or warmer homes or healthier lifestyles, and the co-benefit being the emission savings. So very much to emphasize and support what was said earlier on about looking at the perspective from the audiences, what is understanding what they are already doing, what might motivate them, and also what are the barriers which make it difficult for them to change the behaviors, and how can we help them to overcome those. And also very much built around the idea of using storytelling and case studies of their peers and people within their communities, because this I think really does help show them that the behaviors can be done, and sharing the benefits that these people will have or organizations will have realized from these changing behaviors. And I know there are several people here on the call, I think, from recycling projects, and it was clear that once people started to put out recycling bins in front of their homes and so forth, that people could see that became just a sort of social norm as everybody was doing it. And we've got trying to do this with a whole range of behaviors that we need to influence in terms of helping us to reduce carbon emissions. Very much, I think, as a point made earlier on about having the climate champions within the local community is a helpful way for us to engage people and to encourage them to adopt carbon-saving behaviours. So next slide, please. And also, a couple of the successes, we found that we support a whole range of community groups across Cumbria, and they've successfully engaged with people in their communities. We've also done some significant work trying to make it easier for householders to take some of the more significant behavior changes, if like installing renewables or insulation and so forth, and doing that through working with the supply chains to help them address the particular barriers which makes it difficult for them to take or to change a particular behavior. And also within the carbon literacy training, we have an element of that is for the attendees to make pledges, and I think it's the psychologists have shown that if the individuals actually make their own pledge, it's more likely to be implemented rather than us asking them a question saying, would you do X, Y, Z, to which they might reply yes or no. If we say, what kind of actions could you take, and they then articulate particular actions that they think that they could do, more likely to implement those. And I think it was in previous or in the learning resource, providing feedback, I think, is really important. So if people are changing behaviors, that there's a mechanism for us to go back and thank them for them. And they are genuinely interested in the differences which is being made by those behaviors. So that would be one of the key lessons that we've learned. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you very much, John. That was brilliant. And if anyone's got any questions about John's project, we'll come to that at the discussion at the end. So we move on to Waste Innovation Station, which is run by Cherwell Collective. Hayley, shall I let you introduce your project and then I'll move through the slides? And if you want to chip in, I'm just aware that you didn't see the slides beforehand and don't necessarily know what they say.
Yeah, of course. And I'm happy to answer questions at the end if there are any as well. Yeah, but essentially, Waste Innovation Station, WISH, is a project which is focused on helping individuals themselves reduce their carbon footprint, and specifically through waste repurposing and innovation. And we have a bit of a different approach, as Emily mentioned. Most people who sort of find WISH or Cherwell Collective are not initially super engaged with climate action or necessarily even looking for it. Our slogan is "Come for the food, stay for the revolution." So we sort of get people engaged in a community where they're looking for the sort of rewards that they want, like social community. You know, there's all these sort of learnings that they can take, but as they're participating and getting connected with each other, they are actually participating in climate action. So we've been finding that as people sort of change their behaviors, attitudes are changing as well. So it's this sort of plan developed by Emily, who is an expert in cognitive behavioral therapy and has sort of developed this model for us.
Thanks, Hayley. I think you've kind of covered a couple of those, but yeah, it was a really interesting conversation that I had with Emily when she kind of said, and it's difficult, I think, for people who are passionate about climate action to accept that some people's attitudes will never change, but actually the behavior is changing anyway. So although it's great when their attitude obviously does change and they may become advocates within the community, and we do want to build that community of people whose attitudes towards climate change are changing. She said, you know, we've become okay with the fact that sometimes the behavior changes, the attitude doesn't. It doesn't actually matter because they've changed the way that they're doing things anyway. So yeah, it was quite an enlightening conversation that I had with Emily about that. So yeah, so that was that first point, that some people never actually change their attitudes. And then the second point was about when we talked about the big thank yous and the big rewards and kind of making that really relatable. So Cherwell made this big thank you that they reduced food and saved £9,000 worth of salmon because it was going to go to waste. And that's a huge figure, isn't it? It's quite shocking. And so kind of really making something and understanding that all those individuals have made this big collective change. And I didn't mean to go back. I don't even know how I did that. Yeah, and Emily talked a lot about how anecdotally they've seen that food waste is particularly motivating for people, particularly the people who are accessing Wish, that people know what it's like to be hungry, and there is something really emotive about wasting food. And so that's been something that they've used in kind of a shock and awe mentality, I suppose, in order to try and change the way that people look at waste food and use it. And then on measuring behaviour change, again, Share or Collective create baseline information so that they can see the difference that they're making. It's so important to have that like original baseline of information, so you can see where the stories and the numbers have gone. And then Emily just talked a little bit through about how the limitations, of surveys that here they sent 200,000 out and got 150 back, and there's a particular person who fills in surveys as well, so you're maybe not getting a full picture. And there are perhaps we could talk about that a little bit more in the discussion afterwards, the kind of challenges of actually collecting that amount of baseline information. Yeah, and Emily's wish was that if we could have some kind of centralized data or a survey that everybody asks about climate change, because that doesn't exist. Like I talked about the ONS4 about measuring behaviour change and well-being, about well-being particularly, and so we have those comparisons nationally, but we don't have it about climate action and about climate change. And it would be great if we could get to a point where we're working towards that.
And if I could just add a bit on that, I think that probably some of this information was collected months ago, because since we have sort of completed those rounds of surveys, so we actually did 3 that were about 6 months apart each, and of those we had 20 people that filled it out every time. So we have 20 kind of benchmark people that we were able to measure how their responses changed, which is quite a small sample, but is still quite helpful to see. And honestly, the survey was a bit long, so I do think it would be quite hard to remember exactly what you said last time. And we have some sort of filler questions that are not exactly things we've focused on in our programs to kind of benchmark, if people really are changing their behaviors. And we've learned a lot from it. Mainly, some of our big learnings were that people are caring a lot about packaging food miles, which is really exciting. That's a way that we've helped people to sort of conceptualize their carbon footprint, is through changing, sort of like when we rescue, 9,000 pounds worth of salmon, we say you saved this many miles of driving in a car. That's the equivalent of emissions that you've just saved. And we do that actually with waste repurposing as well, when we help people repair their clothes or turn their textiles into something else. We convert that into car miles as well. And we also had a huge amount of people that filled in, just 2 of the 3 surveys or just 1, and that gives us kind of broad stroke information, and all supplemented with storytelling. Qualitative evaluation has been really lovely too. We have a team that's worked on interviews just with people who've been involved through the pilot project, and that's helped us really understand what motivations people are having, and know what they're still thinking about, what they're worried about, and that's kind of informing how we move forward.
Thanks, Hayley. That's really helpful. And I expect that it's really key what you say about that kind of triangulation of data as well. Obviously, all your data doesn't come from a survey. You're collecting data all the time, and actually in an ad hoc sense, every single project will be collecting data on it. Every time you have a conversation with someone, if you actually make a note of that, it becomes data. As kind of evaluators ourselves, we constantly say to people, well, it's in your head, it's not data. As soon as you write it down, it's a piece of evidence. And that so there'll be, observational and anecdotal you get a feeling, don't you, that things are changing. So I would really encourage you to kind of write those anecdotal things down and those key conversations that you might have with participants, because then you can look at that, you know, do a thematic analysis of that over time, and you will see a difference, and you'll see those journeys. I don't think I've actually popped it on this presentation, but it was just harking back to the very first points that I made, Hayley, and Emily mentioned that it must have been one of the surveys or some sort of research that you did right at the beginning, and people in the area were saying that what they were really worried about was plastic in the sea, and that wasn't something that quite expected to come up, but that you then went with that. And did you create a whale from rubbish or something? There was a sculpture, wasn't there, a waste sculpture that
yes,
powerful.
yes. We actually ended up sort of pivoting that idea to piggyback onto the coronation. So we ended up constructing a unicorn out of waste. So it's in one of our community green spaces now as a permanent exhibit there, but it's made out of all sorts of things, like sofas on the inside to help, you know, old damaged sofas that were going to landfill, old scaffolding poles for the structure, and sort of covered with milk bottles that are fused together. That leads into an herb garden and flower garden as the main. Yeah, but just, you know, we didn't realize people were so concerned about the animals and that bit, especially the sea, where we're not a seaside location. So yeah.
So it's really interesting, isn't it, to have those conversations and work out what those motivations might be, because they might be a bit unexpected. People's kind of idea of what climate action needs to happen. Okay, so this presentation will be available on YouTube to rewatch, so you'll be able to have a look at those links, and all those links are in the resource as well. So you don't need to worry about kind of putting them down, but they're just some of the resources that we use to put the learning resource together. And I'll share the link to that in the chat, so you can have a proper read through. So that's the end of the presentation, and I'm just going to stop recording and stop sharing.